Today the topic we will be starting with is forces in protein folding. Okay. Now, the last few lectures, just trying to go back to what we have done, we started looking at the birth of a peptide or a protein, and then what did we look at? We looked at the development of the secondary structure. Why do you need a secondary structure? We looked at the alpha, right, one of the most common structural elements. Then we looked at a beta, and we saw that beta, if you have to form a beta sheet, then you will be having multiple strands, right, which are interconnected through hydrogen bonds. That one of the major differences between beta and alpha is, in alpha you have these N capping agents, right, N cap and C cap, but in beta you at least have two strands which possibly do not have any capping agents. So, they are free to interact with other moieties. So, that is why beta proteins are so prone to aggregate. Okay. Second, we also looked at, which was the last class, which was kind of, I went through it a little bit hurriedly. What we looked at was mixture, right. That means, we had alpha beta and then we looked at all alpha. That means, alpha elements coming together to form a huge domain or the full protein. And what we saw there was different orientations of one alpha helix with respect to the other, because it does not have to be parallel all the time. It will depend upon the protein, the function, and respective interactions, some of these which would come across later. So, before going any further with the structure, I think that is what we are going to do with respect to the structural aspect. I am not going to go into mixed alpha beta too much or beta, because it just takes a lot of time. Whenever situation arises, or we face a situation like that where we have to take an example, we will take an example, but otherwise this is what you need to know. Okay. So, today we will look at a very important topic. The topic is, you think about this, you start from an unfolded protein, essentially a linear chain or a disordered state of the protein where it comes out, and then it goes to the nascent or the fold. It was a nascent state and it goes to the folded state, which is a native state, right. What are the typical forces? What are the typical forces which act to stabilize the protein against the huge entropy loss which you encounter from going towards a very compact configuration, starting from a very flexible one, because there is indeed a huge loss in entropy. So, the forces can be classified. These are the major contributors, what you can see: electrostatics, right, hydrogen bonding, van der Waals interactions, local interactions, and hydrophobic effect. Now, all of these individually have heard about, and some of these definitely know a lot about, I am sure. What we will do is, though, we will take each of these one by one, okay, and we will try to look at some mathematical aspects and also their relevance in terms of protein folding and forces. Okay. That is what we are going to look at. So, the first thing we start with is something referred to as the range of forces. What do I mean by the range? Range defines the distance that your forces depend upon. So, for example, you can see out here, it varies as r to the power negative of rho, right. Now, think about a Coulomb interaction, like a Coulomb potential, right. It has an inverse of what? R dependence. That means, here rho would be 1, right, your potential, I mean Coulomb potential, rho is 1. Okay. So, there are two different ranges. Obviously, if you have a long range, you will be having a short range. The idea is that both of these forces, for example, van der Waals or dispersion forces, are typically what? Short or long range? These are short range forces. So, look at the definition of long range and short range. So, long range tells you that the rho is less than or equal to 3, right, ion dipole and all those things. The short range is rho greater than 3, which are typically your Lennard-Jones interactions, the van der Waals interactions. So, remember r to the power 6, r to the power 12, right, and all those things, 1 by r to the power 12, that means r to the power minus 12, r to the power minus 6. So, those are your short range forces, because the r dependence is huge. Okay. So, these are two things we always have to keep in mind, because both of these are very much operative in protein folding, right. And then we talk about some interactions known as local interactions. What do we mean by local interactions? Obviously, if you have local interactions, we will also be having non-local interactions. So, the way we define local interactions is this: it occurs among neighbors that are connected. Obviously, if you have a jth residue or an ith residue as shown out here, then if it is connected to I plus 1, it is a neighbor, right. So, it is a local interaction. Or if you look at this, remember in alpha helix you have hydrogen bonds between what, I and I plus 4. So, the same thing happens here. If you can see it out here, you have a local interaction between ith and I plus 4th residue. That means they are pretty near to each other in terms of the sequence. Okay. So, these are local interactions. So, one of the local interactions you already know is dominated by hydrogen bonding, as in case of an alpha helix, right. Now, let us go to the next one, which is where the interactions can be non-local. Now, here you can see what happens. Obviously, one, here the residues would be far apart from each other. That means you will not be having residues which are very next to each other, that is j plus 1, I plus 1, like that. Also, the another difference is, if you look at the figure that is drawn out here, right. In the figure you can see what you mean by non-local. You can have an ith amino acid out here, you can have another ith amino acid, you know, from say another helix chain or from the same helix chain. What is the difference? The difference is non-local is because in terms of the number of residues or in terms of the sequence of the total protein, they are much far apart from each other. Okay. So, why is this relevant? You think about this, when a protein folds, you have seen it in last class and even you know the previous the class before the last one, that if you have say 8 helices, it is not necessary that helix 1 always has to interact with helix 2. If you have helix 1, you can have by geometry, by you know whatever you know this structure, we have helix 8 can come and talk to helix 1, because it depends upon how they fold. So, these are essentially your non-local interactions, and because in a final native state you find a lot of these non-local interactions present, you would definitely assume the non-local interactions can also play an important role in protein folding. Okay. So, before going into the specifics of you know their major contributors, so what we did just learn were two things. One was ranges, which depends upon the distance, and the other one is local and non-local, which depends upon something known as topology, something we have come across before, right. So, this is the difference, range, distance, this one is more of topology. These are called topological neighbors or topological non-neighbors, right. So, let us start with electrostatics. This is the first topic or the first major contributor. Now, why do we care about electrostatics? You know, it is very simple. Electrostatics is all about you know attractions, repulsions, attractive forces, repulsive forces, how you can increase them, how you can decrease them, right, how you can modulate them. But the reason it is so important was actually very straightforward. You think about this, you take a protein, right, a protein which is very stable and it is very well folded in a buffer solution, normal temperature, right, say pH is equal to 7, okay, at room temperature. Now, what people saw was, if they would decrease the pH or increase the pH, what would happen is your proteins would become destabilized. So, if the moment you are increasing or decreasing your pH, what are you playing with? You are playing with hydrogen or hydroxyl ions, that means you are playing with charges. So, obviously, if a variation of charge like this, that means the concentration of hydrogen or hydroxyl can affect the protein folding or the structure of the protein, it just means that electrostatics do play a very important role in maintaining the native structure. Okay. So, that was the first defining point where people showed that electrostatics have to play a role, and hence we have to know about electrostatics. What we will do or try to do in this class is in subsequent classes, go a little bit more into what electrostatics is all about, give you some flavors of you know if people would talk about electrostatics, what typical mathematical equations, mathematical tools they would use, what you know specific things they would try to keep in mind. Okay. So, as shown out here, shown out here rather, pH, what does it show? It shows or determines the overall charge on the protein, obviously, because you start varying, increasing or decreasing pH, accordingly you will proton or deproton residues, the charges will vary. Then also the ionic strength. Now, remember, if you have an attraction or repulsion between two charges, now if you put in salts, what will happen? The salts can actually come in between those, solvate the respective charges and actually screen those interactions. So, that is why not only pH, you have heard about you know these two words, right, salting in or salting out. So, this essentially happens because of these ionic strength. That is what you are doing, you are modulating or changing the ionic strength, right. Okay. So, let us quickly look at the charge interactions. The charge interactions, they obey the Coulomb's law, the potential energy. So, here are two charges Q1 and Q2 shown by spheres, and the potential energy in vacuum, remember in vacuum is given by V of r is equal to Q1 Q2 by 4 pi epsilon 0 r, right. What is epsilon 0? It is the permittivity in vacuum, right. What is r? The distance between the two charges. Okay. Now, this is in vacuum though, that means you have nothing else. What happens or what will happen to this charge charge interaction if I take these two charges and put it in a liquid or a solvent, where obviously it is no longer vacuum, and that solvent might be having its own what? Dielectric constant, right. That means epsilon value. So, that is what this slide now says. Charge interactions are weaker in media. To what extent? They in presence of a liquid of a certain dielectric constant d, they interact in form of this equation, where V of r is equal to 1 by 4 pi epsilon 0, this is the constant which we encountered in the previous equation too. Q1 Q2 the product of the two charges, it is in the denominator in the numerator, r again is the distance, but now we have another term. What is that? It is d, it is the dielectric constant of that respective liquid or solvent. That means now this d is actually trying to do something in terms of modulating the extent of interaction between these two charges. Okay. So, hence as we just said, this extent of weakening of this Coulombic interactions will depend upon the dielectric constant. So, what does dielectric constant really depend upon? It depends upon the polarizability. Now, what do you mean by polarizability? So, for those of you who have keep interest in inorganic chemistry, there is something there are a set of rules you have learned before known as Fajan's rules, right, and Fajan's rules deals with the polarizability of the electron cloud. So, that is what polarizability is all about. So, if you have something which is a polarizable medium, if you would take two charges, you put the two charges in. Now, according to the charge based on the polarizability of that medium of that liquid, those molecules of the liquid would reorient themselves, right. So, for example, if you have a positive and a negative charge, and if say you consider a liquid molecule which has itself a positive and negative end. So, if you have a negative charge, then this positive end would get attracted to that, solvate that. If you have a positive charge, right, the negative end of the dipole would go there and vice versa. That means they would try to solvate or surround your existing charges which are Q1 and Q2. But what does polarizability depend upon? Because you know that not all molecules will be having a very high dipole moment. Okay. One, obviously you can see the first one. The first one is the permanent dipole moment of the liquid molecules, that is what we know. Why? Because if you have a permanent dipole moment, you will be having a positive and negative end, and they would orient themselves with respect to their attractions repulsions as given by the two charges Q1 and Q2, whatever the charges are. But suppose if you do not have a very huge dipole moment, that means you typically take out what? Organic systems, organic liquids, right, hexane, heptane and all these things. Now, their dielectric constants, I will show you a table in the next slide, their dielectric constants are very low. But what do they have? The dielectric constants might be low, but they have electron clouds, and hence these electron clouds can be polarizable depending upon the intrinsic polarizability, right, and they can also impose their dielectric constant d through this interaction. That means they do not have to have a well defined dipole moment all the time. The dipole moment might be small, obviously then d would be small, but then even if you have a small d, its electrons would still reorient based on whatever Q1 and Q2 you have. That means respond to the charges you have put in the solution, right. The last one is actually quite important. The last one is the hydrogen bond network, and hydrogen bond network, you know, where your water is full of this hydrogen bond network. So, what it means is, if you would be putting in two charges in a liquid like water, what you are doing is you are also disrupting the hydrogen bond network of the water, but because water is your solvent, you have so many hydrogen bonds. So, it will not be too much of an energetic penalty if some of the hydrogen bonds have to break and reorient according to the charges you are putting in, because you have an extensive hydrogen bonding network. It is not that you have just localized hydrogen bonding. If you had been localized hydrogen bonding, then you would be disrupting those bonds, and that would be a huge penalty. But in case of water, that is not true, right? Throughout uniformly you have an extensive hydrogen bond network, and typically when these charges you take, the concentration of water is always very high and the charges is typically low. So in that case still you have extensive hydrogen bond network which is not disrupted, or even though disrupted they are self compensated by combining with the respective charges. Okay. So that is why hydrogen bound network is very important, because it allows the solvent to kind of talk to the charges put in and also self compensate whatever disruptions those two charges are putting in, or you are putting in once you put them in the solution in water. Okay. So these are some dielectric constants. Let's take a look at this. The highest dielectric constants are of formamide. Okay. Did you guys know this? You guys knew this? Okay. So water obviously comes next, and then you can see when we come down, methanol is 33, the dielectric constant, heptane is barely 2. So obviously you can understand that heptane will not be able to separate the charges, that means the D would be very small, right. So what does the dielectric constant do? Essentially the molecules come in between the charges, and with respect to the dielectric constant they try to shield one charge with respect to the other, essentially they screen it. Same thing happens when you put salts in, right, they screen it. Now do you know why formamide has more dipole moment than water? See, water has extensive hydrogen bonding, that is given, but how would you rationalize? One of the ways of doing it is that formamide has a pretty high dipole moment, right, and formamide, like any other organic system, also has extensive electronic polarizability, and these two in combination with some other things give formamide this exclusive place in the dielectric constant list of being more than that of water. But guys, generally we do not use formamide. What we do is whatever protein chemistry we do, mostly it is always in water. So that is what we are going to focus on mostly. Okay. So let us look at why does NaCl ionize in water. But before actually going to that, we try to introduce something. This is known as Jerome length. Have you heard of this before, the Jerome length? So let us see what it means. So you already know this, right. So V of R, so V of R is equal to 1 by 4 pi epsilon 0 q1 q2 by R. Okay, we already have seen this. Now what does Jerome length say? Jerome length says the Jerome length is given by this symbol LB, okay, where B stands for Jerome length, right. So this Jerome length is that length, that means this LB is that length or that value of R, where R is what? The difference or the separation between the two charges q1 and q2 is that length or that value of R, where this is really important, V of R is equal to RT, where V of R is equal to RT. So that means when R is equal to LB, when R is equal to LB, V of R will be equal to what? RT. So based on this definition, what we can write is then RT is equal to 1 by 4 pi epsilon 0 q1 q2 by what do I write instead of R? LB, good. And then remember when we are doing RT, generally what we see, you see is KT, right, but then when does it become RT, right. So I can write an N out here for Avogadro number of molecules, right, where N is, so this is Na, where Na is referred to as the Avogadro number, okay. So Na is your Avogadro's number. Now what is the significance of this? The significance is this: what does RT correspond to and KT correspond to? KT corresponds to your thermal energy, right. Why? Well, you know K is your what Boltzmann constant, it has a certain unit of energy over temperature. you time it by T, you get energy. Okay. So, what it means is that at this distance r is equal to L b, your potential energy of interaction between these two particles would be typically equal to your thermal energy. That means, whatever energy you are putting in from the, you are not putting in essentially from the thermal, from the surroundings. If you are not heating the system or anything at room temperature, then that is the temperature, or rather that is the length at L b where this R T is equal to your V of R. Okay. So, what can we write here? So, just to express L b in terms of R T, I can write this again. I can write L of b is equal to 1 by 4 pi epsilon 0 q 1 q 2 over R T, right, times n. So, this is a very well known and formal expression of the Jerome length. Graphically, how would we represent, or how would we understand this? Say for example, if I am drawing a graph like this, the graph is very simple. If I am drawing a graph like this and say suppose on my y axis I have V of R, right, which is essentially a potential energy. On my x axis I will be having what, R, right, because you are plotting a potential V of R against the the distance of separation between these two charges. So, if your potential energy of interaction say goes like this, okay, just a random one, then if this is your R T, if this is your R T, that means R T is now the potential energy, right. What is the corresponding point on the x coordinate? It would be L b. Excellent. So, this one would be now L b. So, graphically, some graphs are really helpful to understand things, especially physical aspects, mathematical equations. So, you can see in your potential energy curve, it is not that your L b is everywhere. When do you get the L b? L b is defined as that distance where your V of R is equal to your thermal energy, right. I keep repeating this because thermal energy is very important. When you guys did statistical mechanics before, you talked about something, or if you remember it, you must have discussed about something known as thermal fluctuations. Now, fluctuations are always on the order of k T for a molecule or R T for n number of molecules. So, think about it, at this length your thermal fluctuation energy is equal to your potential energy of interaction between the two charges, right. This is the underlying significance. Hold on to this thought and I will tell you why it is so significant. We will just take an example. Before going on further, let us just do one more thing. What I can do is, I can write, if I write say V of R, I will just write this again, say V of R by R T. So, if I write B of R by R T, so what should I get? So, this should be equal to what? Can you tell me? L b by R. Is everybody okay with that? Just check. If I take V of R over R T, that means when I am doing V of R, I am keeping R as R. When I am doing R T, I am keeping R equal to L b. Okay. So, what have you just found out? So, this is an equation. You have found out a relation. You have found out a relation between, this is significant, V of R, temperature, which is T, right, the Jerome length L b, and the distance of separation R, and the distance of separation R. Okay. So, for example, suppose you know your R, okay. Suppose you know your L b, then you can easily find at a given temperature the potential energy of interaction. See, this potential energy of interaction is very important. We have to know what is the force or what is the energy of interaction between these particles before we take it for some further steps or further calculations, right. So, are you guys okay with this up till this point, right? Now, let us look at the slide again. If you can take a look at the slide. Now, here we are doing a calculation, okay, a formal calculation, and see the significance of this. We are doing a Jerome length calculation L of b. What we are doing is, we are taking sodium chloride. The question we are asking is, why does sodium chloride ionize in water, right? Now, this you all know. Let us look at it from the thing we just developed from that point of view, and you will see why it is so significant. So, obviously D is 78.5, let us take the temperature to be 298.15 Kelvin, right. Now, LB is given by that. If you put in all the values, okay, if you put in all the values, you know what the permittivity is, you can look this up, you know what the electronic charge is, you know what Avogadro's number is, you will encounter a value of 7.13 angstroms. Okay. Now, this you are formally calculating. Now, this for you is left as an exercise, please do the calculations and see whether you are getting it or not, just to familiarize yourself with how people actually do these calculations and make estimates on the Jerem length, right, from given conditions. See, conditions are not that hard to get, right. If you have it in water, you know the directly constant, the temperature is always given to you. If you do not know, if you are doing it at room temperature, you know what the temperature is. Nowadays it is very cold, you can take that temperature, so like that. Now, this thing we also developed just before, right, that V of R over RT is equal to LB over R, we just derived. Now, what can we use it for? Let us go to the next slide. Here R, remember, it is the distance between the two charges. So, we take this R from say a crystal lattice of sodium chloride. We know, people know how the sodium chloride crystal cell is arranged, and you can easily read off parameters, right. Cell parameters from X-ray crystal structures have been solved. So, here people have said that you can assume the internal spacing to be 2.81 angstroms, right. Now, given this equation and do a formal calculation, you see what I am taking is, in this case I am taking the temperature to be 300 Kelvin, right. The V of R, you understand why it is negative. Why is it negative? The interaction potential, why is it negative? Attraction, right, because I have a negative charge and a positive charge, that is what I am looking at, because I am having to ionize, right, two charges essentially. It gives me a value of minus 1.5 kilocalories per mole at this given temperature. Now, this value is only a little more than 2 RT, right, you can do it, it is only a little more than 2 RT. Now, what does that tell you? Without even trying to think about the question, think about the system first. It is like this. The interaction energy at this length is minus 1.5 kilocalories per mole. The value is a little more than 2 RT, right. What is RT? RT essentially is your thermal fluctuation, right. Getting 2 RT on fluctuation is not a huge deal. Now, see, you are at a point where the interaction energy between these two is not that high, right, based on what? The thermal energy you are putting in. So, because it is just twice RT, if there is any thermal fluctuation, right, and these things can always happen, you have so many molecules, so many collisions happening out there, you will easily get rid of what? Your thermal fluctuations can easily override what? The potential energy of interaction between the sodium and chloride ions. That is what it means. See, this is something possibly you have to realize, what you are actually doing now is you are looking at this one from a mathematical point of view, you are actually calculating energies now. Now, you are actually calculating and seeing why sodium chloride does ionize or dissociate in water. It has no other choice. Why? Because based on the Jerem length, based on this interionic spacing, the interaction energy between these ions is not that high. You put it in water, you have the D coming in, right, that decreases the interaction energy a lot more. See, the same thing would not be happening in vacuum, right. Why not? Because the D is not there. There is nothing to separate these two from each other, but here the D comes in, and this value again is so close to your thermal fluctuation, your thermal energy you are putting in, that the moment you put it in water, it just simply separates out, right. So, obviously, if you are giving more energy, they are going to dissociate more, right. But sodium chloride almost always fully dissociates in water. Anyway, what it means is, and this is the take home point. The take home point is, when you look at Jerem length, right, when you look at Jerem length already tells you that if my potential energy is equal to the energy RT, the potential energy interaction is equal to my energy RT, which is the thermal fluctuation that I am putting in. At that point I am very close to what? Easily dissociating or separating the ions from each other. Now that is the significance of this Jerome length, and that is why it is not that we always come across this parameter, but this parameter makes so much of a sense. Now you can understand why, right. So this is another way of trying to look at how species or salts do dissociate in water, right. So what I will do is I will stop here for today. Okay. You guys think about this Jerome length. Next day what I will do is I will start with a little more of this electrostatic interactions, and I will give you a flavor of what people do. I will give you a flavor of what people do. We will introduce something known as a Poisson-Boltzmann equation. Okay, PBE is short form. It is a Poisson-Boltzmann equation, and this will tell you more about these electrostatic interactions, these charge-charge interactions, what are the things it depends upon, and this is very close. So something you guys know or are very familiar with. It starts with a D. What is that in case of ions or ionic charges? Huh? No, dielectric constant is constant. Debye, it starts with the Debye-Huckel theory, right. It is very close to that, and Debye-Huckel theory actually comes from this. We are going to look at the derivation essentially of this Debye-Huckel theory from here. Okay. So this is how we are going to frame the next few classes. So the underlying principle is that when you take up each and every interaction like electrostatics, hydrogen bonding, van der Waals, hydrophobic effect, we will go a little bit deeper into these effects. If you have seen it, it is good. If you have not seen it, it is even better. You see it here, right. You have to know these interactions. It is not only that these interactions stabilize the proteins, but also what is this interactions made up of, right. What are the factors that affect these interactions? How can we think about these interactions from a mathematical point of view? Especially one of the most important things we know in proteins is hydrophobic effect. What exactly is hydrophobic effect? What do people mean by these two words, hydrophobic? What do people mean? Hydrophobic effect has a huge effect in protein thermodynamics, right. And many people say obviously that it is one of the major forces. So we have to know hydrophobic effect in a lot more detail. So along with that we will also look at importance of hydrogen bonds, the involved energetics, to what extent they contribute to the protein stability. Okay, thank you.